So welcome everybody to this conversation with Freya Mathews, part of our series called Changing Our Minds. My name is Deborah Colvin. I'm a member of the Earth Justice team at St James's Church in Piccadilly in London, which is hosting this series. And my collaborators are Sarah Mark, who's an artist and placemaker, and Diane Pacitti, who's a poet. We think of this series as an exploration of sources of wisdom and praxis that might help humanity move into a new era of mutual flourishing for all species on the Earth, an era that we might call ecozoic in both geological and theological language. Before we start, I'm in London and I'd like to acknowledge the long history of these lands now called Britain and all of the beings within them. We know that people have lived with this land for at least 35,000 years, and for much of this time, the land was acknowledged as sacred, with ceremonies, songs, and ways of relating that made a living bond between land and people. We also acknowledge the damage done by our colonizing behaviours, the domination of some groups by others, both within these islands and across the world. So, Freya Mathews is Emeritus Professor of Environmental Philosophy at La Trobe University in Melbourne. Her book, The Ecological Self, first published in 1991 and republished in 2021, has been described as illuminating the relationship between physics and metaphysics and between knowledge and faith, and the book for which serious students of deep ecology have been waiting. Her most recent book is The Tao of Civilization, a letter to China, which I hope she'll mention in this conversation. Freya's current special interests include ecological civilization, Indigenous perspectives, both Australian and Chinese, on regenerativity, panpsychism, conservation ethics. Freya also helps to care for a private conservation reserve in Northern Victoria and is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Welcome, Freya. We're so delighted that you can take some time to speak with us today. And I'm going to hand over to Freya in a moment, and she's going to speak to us for around about 35 minutes. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity for me to throw some questions to her. Over to you, Freya.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. It's a great joy to be with you and your community, and thanks to you and to Diane and Sarah for inviting me onto your series. I should also like to acknowledge where I'm speaking from. I'm speaking to you from southeastern Australia, Melbourne, otherwise known as Naarm in the local Indigenous language. And I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this area and traditional owners of this country, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank the country that has nourished and taught me of many years. I'm here in the inner north of Melbourne, or Naarm, and I've been living here for more than 40 years. And during that time, I've enjoyed a close relationship with the local creek, the Merry Merry. The Merry Creek means rocky, rocky in Wurundjeri language. And I just have such a debt of gratitude to all that I have learned and seen from that creek and from the surrounding country, and also from some country in northwestern Victoria, up in the semi-arid lands in northwestern Victoria, a granite outcrop there that I have also had a close association with, and a tremendous debt of gratitude to, which may come up in the conversation at the end, my experience of becoming family with country. I'm going to do a talk first, and I have a script which I'm going to read. So I've been watching some of the conversations in this Changing Our Mind series, and been so impressed with the richness and quality of the conversations you've been having. And as your previous guests have been indicating in their different ways, and as many people are currently coming to realize, the reductive materialist view of the world, the view that we inherited from the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and that underpins our modern industrial civilization, is wreaking havoc on the biosphere. It's threatening the future of life on Earth. That's such a trite and easy thing to say, but it's completely unimaginable, really, in its scope and implications. Many people are accordingly trying to construct alternatives to this worldview, trying to provide different metaphysical foundations for the way we humans collectively inhabit our Earth. I think it's fair to say that most people who are engaged in this search for alternatives are looking for a more holistic understanding of things. We hear this in repeated calls to see all things as interconnected. And this is quite a mantra, as everyone will be aware. And to see ourselves as humans as part of this interconnected, indivisible, larger whole, rather than seeing the world as made up of bits and pieces that we're at liberty to take apart to suit our own arbitrary purposes. In some ways, contemporary science seems also to be heading in this holistic direction, after starting out back in the 17th century with an extreme form of atomism that explained physical phenomena by breaking them down into discrete constituent particles. By contrast with this old atomism, fundamental sciences like physics are now filled with ideas of fields and quantum entanglement and non-locality and so on. But I think we need to be cautious in face of this apparent change in the direction of science. Well, why would I say that? I think there are several reasons. The deepest one, though, in my view, has to do with the distinctive way of knowing that characterizes science. Scientists, as knowers, position themselves at a remove from reality. They seek understanding through theory, but the theory is their own construct. The scientist is the author of the theory. She creates it, she acts on it, but it doesn't act on her. As its author, she's not part of the theory. So insofar as she sees the world through the lens of theory, she remains psychologically as the theorist outside the world. And this is reflected in her external methodology. Scientists position themselves as detached observers of phenomena, often acting on those phenomena through experimentation, but not themselves being acted upon. They investigate things, in other words, from the outside. A truly holistic way of understanding reality would, by contrast, have to include the knower in the world they're seeking to know. And I think this implies that holistic understanding must ultimately be arrived at via direct experiences of rapprochement with reality, rather than via the distancing lens of theory. This applies to philosophy, by the way, as much as to science. Well, I mean, it applies even more to science, but it also applies to philosophy. The knower must make himself available to be acted upon by the world as well as acting on it. He must be prepared to be touched by the world. Nevertheless, theorizations do remain important because they motivate us to experiment with new ways of being in the world. If we think there are good rational grounds for adopting a more holistic view of reality, then we might be prepared to explore new experiential practices. And if these practices result in new forms of experience, then our theories may help us to interpret these experiences and integrate them into our culture. The theories will also help us to defend our emerging holistic perspective against the skepticism of a wider society still deeply invested in the old reductive paradigm. So, with all those qualifiers, let me outline here very briefly. It's just going to be a snapshot. My own version of a holistic worldview. Firstly, at the level of theory, and then at the level of the more intuitive practices that I think this theoretical framework opens up. As I'm a philosopher, my particular version of holism has developed within the context of environmental philosophy, and more particularly within the context of a conversation amongst eco-philosophers that began here in Australia several decades ago. As such, I think of my approach as, in certain respects, a place-based outlook, a way of understanding and participating in the cosmos that's rooted in this land, though this outlook has, of course, also absorbed many influences from outside Australia. In any case, the version of holism that's come together for me over these decades and in this place, and out of a particular skein of influences, is one that I've come to call living cosmos panpsychism. To approach the idea of living cosmos panpsychism, we might start by noting that the universe at large, the universe that we can see for ourselves in the night sky and that astronomy has revealed to us, is to all appearances self-creating, self-regulating, and self-renewing. In a word, self-realizing. It maintains itself and increases its existence under its own steam, so to speak. Since these are properties we normally associate with living systems, let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, that our universe is a living system, a unity that is so organized as to create, maintain, and increase its own existence. Let's think of it not merely as an ad hoc collection of material bodies, particles, celestial bodies, and clusters of celestial bodies and such like, but as a single unity or substance, in fact, as space itself, with a fluid-like structure or geometry. Everything we can see and measure in our universe is, from this point of view, a disturbance like a ripple or current in this fundamental field-like manifold. The 17th century philosopher Spinoza called such deformations modes of the fundamental substance. So from this point of view, all material particulars, including ourselves, are modes of this great living being we call the cosmos. And since it's a living system, let's think of its fabric as not merely physical, but irreducibly psychophysical. Let's imagine that there is an innerness to this dynamic unfolding space, as well as an outerness. It's imbued with inner impulses, animated by a primal will to exist and to increase its existence. Spinoza used the Latin word conatus to refer to a will to self-existence and self-increase. And from this, we can derive the word conativity to refer to such a will, derived from a Latin word meaning a will to self-existence and self-increase. So it's a will that informs living things, that drives them to continually actualize their own existence. And we derive conativity from that word. So the living cosmos unfolds its existence both by globally expanding itself, think the expanding universe, and by self-differentiating via patterns of disturbance in its psychophysical fabric. These patterns of disturbance eventually include complex little local configurations that are also relatively self-maintaining and self-renewing, like little whirlpools that arise in the context of particularly intricate patterns of wave interference. These whirlpool-like configurations hold their identity for a time before dissolving back into the surrounding field. Because they actively, dynamically hold their geometric conformation for a time, we can think of them as themselves living systems, the kinds of organisms and ecosystems we find on Earth. As such, they're possessed of a derivative connotivity of their own, an individual will to self-existence. Although they actively maintain their individual structure for a time, they are, of course, no less part of the field-like fabric of the universe than all the other disturbances ebbing and flowing around them. So their connotivity is real in as much as each self-system actively seeks to distinguish itself from the ebb and flow of its environment, but it's also only relative. Each self-system is still continuous with the unity of substance. The living cosmos, as pictured here, may be described as panpsychist because every aspect of its physical structure is an outward expression of an inner field of awareness or subjectivity. In other words, every aspect of physical existence also has a mental dimension, a dimension of inner awareness, consciousness, and vice versa. Every mental particular has a physical aspect. As modes of this greater psychophysical field, our role in this panpsychist scheme of things is clearly to contribute in some way to the ongoing unfolding of the cosmos, to its ongoing self-renewal and self-increase. But what is this contribution? I want to pick out two key concepts in this connection that I think can help us to answer this question. The first concept is ontopoetics, and the second one is deep law, capital D, capital L, deep law. So firstly, ontopoetics. To see what I mean by ontopoetics, let's remember that from the perspective of the living cosmos, the special capacity of organisms to feel, think, and communicate represents an enrichment of the universe's own field of experience. It represents new possibilities of finitude, of a multiplicity of perspectives, of dialogue, and of increasing reflexivity or self-awareness in the otherwise expansive and singular field of unity of awareness. But in addition to these further dimensions of enrichment that organisms bring to the larger field of awareness, there's a dimension that's largely overlooked in modern societies. This lies in the possibility of communication between organisms and the cosmos itself. Such a form of communication would surely open up new, indeed transformative registers of experience, and in this sense, increase the psychophysical richness of the overall field. The idea that we as humans do have a capacity to engage in such a form of communication, and that the universe has a capacity to respond in kind, is what lies behind the idea of ontopoetics. So, what would a communicative exchange between ourselves and the cosmos look like? This isn't, in fact, an entirely unfamiliar phenomenon. Many of us have been visited at some point in our lives by a certain kind of experience which, though striking, confounds our modern cultural categories. We have no way of processing it within the terms of the received discourses of our society. In pre-modern societies, experiences of this kind were often read as omens or signs. In Indigenous societies, they may be understood as references to old or new dreamings. In a more contemporary Western context, Carl Jung spoke of synchronicities, mysterious manifestations in the outer environment of inner states of a person's psyche, manifestations that Jung named but was unable to explain. Omens, signs, dreamings, synchronicities. These terms suggest in their different ways instances of I-thou encounter between self and something larger, moments when that something larger seems to speak directly to the human self in a language that is both apposite and intimate. Let's step back from earlier interpretations of this mysterious phenomenon and view it instead, again, for the sake of the argument, as an instance of direct communicative encounter between ourselves and the living cosmos. In order for such a communicative encounter to occur, we presumably first need to assume a stance of address. We need, in some basically ceremonial way, to invoke the cosmos. If the cosmos responds to our invocation, its response will be recognizable as a response because it will deploy the terms of reference of the invocation itself. Of course, the language that the cosmos will speak in response to our invocations can only be a concrete one. It will be the language of poetics, of imagery, of meaning conveyed through the symbolic resonance of things. It's in such language, traditionally the language of both poetic narrative and of dreams, that our invocations need to be couched so that they may in due course be answered in the same language, this language of things. The term ontopoetics is intended to capture this cluster of meanings. Ontos, from the ancient Greek word for being, or for having the status of an existent thing, and poetics, both in its modern sense and in a sense drawn from the ancient Greek poiesis, making or creating. Reality is then, from this ontopoetic point of view, not only informed with meanings of its own, but it's disposed to interact with us on the level of meaning to create new poetic configurations. The history of religion is full of what I'm calling ontopoetic moments. Think of the Old Testament, the burning bushes, parting seas, pillars of cloud by day and of fire by night, significant rainbows or bolts of lightning, unusual celestial bodies, all might be seen as responses of a living cosmos to implicit invocations framed by the poetic narrative of the Hebrew religion. And many of us will remember significant moments in our own lives when something like a sign appeared in our physical environment, legible in the terms of our own private or shared frame of reference, as if in response to an implied invocation. It might be a rainbow. Rainbows are actually seemingly quite popular ontopoetic tropes. It might be finding a gold ring on a track in some out-of-the-way place, or it might be a sudden visitation by a wild animal. Whatever it may be, when I do invoke the world ceremonially by way of such a narrative frame of reference, and when the world responds to me with an emanation or conjunction of circumstances clearly referenced to that same story, I can't help but be stunned. There is such intimacy in the revelation, such largesse in the gesture, such unexpectedness. One can hardly help but surrender to the experience. One's heart is opened up to an entirely new register of salience and purpose. It's through ontopoetic communion, then, I want to suggest that the living cosmos pulls us into alignment with deep law, capital D, capital L, deep law. So, what is deep law? The living cosmos must presumably unfold itself in accordance with a normative logic that's conducive to its ongoing self-realization. Since we exist only as modes of the cosmic connectivity, we need to try to discover this normative logic so that we can align our own lives with it and thereby contribute effectively to cosmic unfolding. And what is this logic? Well, I think we find our clue in ecology. There is a distinctive strategy discernible in stable ecosystems that enables living things to maintain and increase their existence most effectively. This strategy is basically one of accommodation. Each living thing seeks to satisfy its own kinetic needs in ways that least disrupt the connectivities of others. Indeed, ideally, creatures fulfill their needs in ways that support the connectivities of others, providing life-giving opportunities or resources for them. The best example of this logic is perhaps provided by what biologists call ecosystem engineers. And the best known example of an ecosystem engineer is the famous beaver. What do beavers want? They want safe refuges from river turbulence and from predators. To this end, they dam waterways to create still ponds in which they can build convenient stick lodges. These dams redirect stream flows, in the process hydrating the entire surrounding landscape, creating wetlands that provide habitat for myriads of other plant and animal species. At the same time, these wetlands provide the necessary conditions for healthy waterways and hence for healthy beavers. Healthy ecosystems generally are held together and continually regenerated by countless such synergies. This logic of accommodation, which is at the same time a logic of least resistance, correlates at a deep level, I think, with the notion of Wu Wei, so central to the Chinese philosophy of Taoism, where Taoism, you might remember, is the indigenous philosophy of China that has its roots in pre-agrarian China. It also, this logic of accommodation and least resistance also has affinities with the biological concept of symbiosis. If we accept this as an innate logic of cosmological unfolding, a normative logic, since highly reflexive beings such as ourselves are not bound to follow it deterministically, then we might describe this logic as an ought at the core of the is, a deep law that we, as modes of cosmic connectivity, should strive to follow. This notion of deep law also has strong resonances with Aboriginal notions of law, or first law. However, since we humans, as I said, have the capacity for reflexive thought, we can choose our own path through life. We can think about what we desire. We can think about our thoughts and our ideas, and so we can change them. So we can choose our own path through life. We're free to follow the ought at the core of the is, or we can allow ourselves to be sidetracked by the many distractions and ideologies that our present-day topsy-turvy consumer societies thrust upon us. Just being visited by a magpie outside my window.
An ontopoetic moment.
This is where ontopoetics comes back into the picture. Once we have experienced the astonishment of ontopoetic encounter, we're truly shifted on our metaphysical moorings. We now know that we are noticed by the cosmos, that the horizon of our existence and significance is far, far wider and higher than we had ever imagined. This is a new axis of meaning for our lives. We're accountable, not merely to our society, but to a cosmos that seemingly sees us and perhaps even takes the trouble to salute us. This is a new dimension of intimacy, perhaps for us of love, that calls us into alignment with deep law. All competing distractions for our attention are by comparison reduced to tawdry irrelevance. From here on, we'll simply be unable to bear to continue living in ways that trash this tender cosmos and disrupt the poetic order. We have indeed been pulled inside the cosmos into its subjective interior, where this is a form of congress that can only be achieved via feeling. Our will has become coincident with the cosmic connectivity, and with this, and only with this, I think, we make the transition to a holistic perspective. Well, if we're on board with all of this, then we'll surely be wondering, how we can cultivate the sensibilities proper to ontopoetics and deep law in our own lives. Are there specific practices and indeed specific forms of economic praxis that can be deployed? Well, one set of practices that I've been involved in exploring with a team of colleagues through a short course at Schumacher College recently is via small cooperative inquiry groups of 5 or 6 members per group. The aim of the course, called Living Waters, is to provide an opportunity for participants to spend dedicated time each week in communion with a particular river or other waterway in their own neighborhood. The idea is for them to try to engage with this river at some kind of communicative level. So they start by ceremonially addressing the river in some way, and then paying close, loving attention to it, taking note of the detail and nuance of every particular, as well as the layered patterns of ecological coherence that it presents. At the same time, participants open themselves to signs of communicative intent that might become evident. Together with members of their small inquiry groups, they then try week by week to make sense of the resulting experiences, where this adds a critical and reflective edge to their interpretations. The cooperative process also bonds the members of the groups into collectives that share an emerging new perspective, thereby creating small pods of a nascent culture. Perhaps this is a first step towards re-inhabiting our world as a living cosmos. In Aboriginal English here in Australia, there is a word that has entered the wider Australian vernacular, country with a capital C. As Sandra Wool-Torton, one of my colleagues in the Living Waters course, puts it in a recent paper, country is living, responsive and caring, and the word is capitalized to denote an Indigenous understanding of one's place, which connects people, socio-economic systems, language, spirit, and nature through interrelationship. End of quote. I think it would be fair to say that this word country signifies a localization of a living cosmos. Here in Australia, country has been sung into communicativity and responsiveness by thousands of years of ceremonial address. Aboriginal people experience what I'm here calling ontopoetics in their own country on a routine basis, and they exercise many other sensory and affective forms of attunement to country as well. Some of these developed as active adaptations that were necessary for forms of livelihood that depended on intimate knowledge of local ecologies and custodianship of those ecologies. In other words, some of these cognitive capacities arose from the material and economic culture of traditional Aboriginal societies. They grew out of the everyday fabric of Aboriginal ways of life. For those of us who are not Indigenous to the places in which we live, or who have lost our deeper cultural connections to these places, these older ways of life and custodianship have, of course, given way to industrial modes of production that not only blind us to local ecologies, but in fact tend to destroy those ecologies outright. Under these conditions, it may seem doubtful whether we could deepen our budding holistic consciousness to the point where it really could start to direct our lives. Is there any remedy then for this? This is perhaps a point for discussion. With current global population levels, we can't go back to pre-agrarian or Aboriginal modes of livelihood. But there may be other ways in which we can, at a personal level, reinvent custodial roles today and thereby enter into deep ongoing relationship with a particular place where this might in turn increase our attunement to its inner life and hence to deep lore. And I have some experience of this, which I'd be happy to share. And
Yes,
at
please.
a societal level, there may even be ways of reconfiguring and deindustrializing our economic praxis so that even our current large-scale societies could start to align again to a degree with deep lore. So with those enormous questions, I'll finish the talk.
Honestly, thank you so much. That is so incredibly rich, and it's been my privilege to be a part of the recent Living Waters course. So I feel there is so much possibility coming out of this. Do you know, the first thing that comes to me is, how can we now have a little bit of conversation time that is holistic? You know, I've written down a ton of analytic questions, but what would a conversation look like between you as a emanation of the universe and me as emanation, an enriched part of the whole background of cosmos? You know,
Well, that's such a good
what would that look
question.
like if we did it
What
holistically?
do you think?
How would
What
we
do you think?
accommodate? How would we accommodate to each other?
Well, we probably wouldn't be doing this head-to-head thing.
Yeah, we
Like,
wouldn't.
we'd probably be out on country, singing up, singing up country, like communing with one another in that process.
Mm,
But our communion with one another would be just a part of this larger communicative process, which would be not this like intense intellectual head-to-head thing at all, dancing and ceremony and a bit of like, include dogs and kids running around getting into trouble and
yeah,
and a bit of like, abstruse intellectual exchange, because Aboriginal people, when they're talking about metaphysical matters arising from their own experience of reality, are deeply philosophical.
mm,
It's just
mm,
that non-Aboriginal people have been so unable to follow where they're going that a conversation has not been able to develop. So I think like that, I don't know, but that would be my image. We'd be out there like, we'd be dancing, feeding kids, making up
yeah,
dog fights and doing ceremony and doing a bit of fire stick work on the rubbish we see that is like weeds and things that we see around the campsite, like all
yeah.
of that.
And we might be making art, might we?
Yeah, we'd be making art. Yes,
Yeah,
I'd left that out. Yeah, that would
yeah,
be
yeah.
big.
Phenomenal. You know,
What about you? Do you have an image of what it would be like?
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I'd be doing all of that.
it so wouldn't be this head-to-head thing
Yeah,
on computer screens, would it?
yeah. I think we might be walking as well, and I think
Yeah, we'd be
the people
walking, yeah.
being side on a bit. You know, I'm thinking of not staring. Well, in our case,
Yes,
we're
yes,
staring at a camera,
yes, yes.
but
Yes, it's really
sitting a bit side
rude.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's rude to stare at
Yeah,
people.
yeah. That takes me in two directions. One is kind of thinking of our situation where we have I'm a part of a church that takes part in quite a traditional liturgy, but there is richness in that is, we
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
would have, not many, but with the kids are playing, the dogs come, we have many dogs in our church, um so that's there, but it's very stylized as well, and I wonder whether there's ways of, which is rich in itself, but
Yes,
ways of bringing in the wildness and the rest of the world that is also participating. The whole of creation gives praise. So it seems to be an ongoing challenge.
well, I think, I mean, you know, what I think the living cosmos likes. But, you know, I think the living cosmos probably likes your liturgy. And would love to join in, given a chance.
Well, then I have to say, in response to that, Freya, ours is a Wren church, Christopher Wren Church, 1684, and so there's all of this clear glass, and the living
Yeah.
cosmos streams in on us at all
Well, I
kinds
bet
of
you only
times
have
of
to
day.
look up when there are shooting stars
Yeah,
and, you know, owls flying across the nave, and I'll bet it's all happening.
yeah. Yes, if we all, yes, we need to open our consciousnesses perhaps differently again. Can I go on my other stream of thought there then, which is about you and your land, that your piece of country where you are, north of Melbourne, is it, where you're involved with
Yeah,
caring
yeah,
for country?
it's about 200 k's from
Yeah.
Melbourne.
So what does that look like? You caring for country on that place. I've seen an amazing video of you speaking as you walk across country. But how does it look?
Well, it's a granite outcrop. It's a very archaic, kind of potent landform, very stern feeling landform. The surrounding country is semi-arid, but you know, granite outcrops in Australia and around the world actually always have their own endemic ecosystem. They have a granite ecosystem, so that and you get the same species on granite outcrops right across Australia. I mean, there are species on granite outcrops in Western Australia that are at Mount Curong, even though, you know, it's like 5,000 kilometers between them, and they're only on granite outcrops. So that gives a granite outcrop a feeling of being an island. I mean, geologically, they're considered islands. They're like island ecosystems, and the geological term for them is Inselberg, a granite Inselberg, which just means island in German. So it is like having one's own little country. It is actually it's kind of a way of being able to become familiar with, intimate with a localization of the living cosmos. It's like having one's own little holy land, because you can encompass it completely. You can walk it, you can observe everything, and there's something kind of self-contained about it relative to the surrounding kind of plains, you know. So that's very special about re-inhabiting a granite outcrop. So like a little world, which helps to give it a sense of sacredness, I think. Well, I mean, I started to look after this land about 15 years ago, although I had a place there 10 years before that, but I wasn't actively trying to restore it then. I didn't even know much about that at that time. But almost 15 years ago, I started trying to ecologically restore the part of this granite outcrop that I had responsibility for. I don't want to use the awful word own.
Yeah.
In its Western sense, you know, all these words, property and ownership and so on, are obviously completely inappropriate for an ancient landform like that. Like I am a descendant of invaders who took it over from the rightful traditional owners. But anyway, it came into my hands to look after. And so that has been an incredible journey for me in terms of both increasing my own ecological literacy because all very well to do environmental philosophy, but that doesn't necessarily give you much on the ground ecological knowledge. So this was an opportunity to try to get to know the ecology of a particular landform. And that's like an endless journey, because the knowing that is required is inexhaustible. To try, it's an endless process of uncovering layer after layer after layer of the ecology. So there's just tremendous joy in doing that. And it also involved kind of mobilizing all the local conservation agencies, getting to know that network. And actually the countryside is alive with local conservation groups and agencies and things that I didn't know about at all. Workshops all the time on things like bats and fungus and, like wonderfully informative workshops that are just for like local landholders and interested people. So that's the whole world that I didn't know about. And so science comes into that. Like those agencies all use a scientific approach to conservation. So one had to try to become, apprised of all the relevant conservation science, at least to the degree necessary to decide what works to do on the property, the reserve. And then amidst all this, one is spending a lot of time there and mixing one's labor, with this place. And this has been a pathway to ontopoetics for me, in as much as I have felt that close attention, not to say loving attention, that I've been paying to the place, starting to elicit a sense of its presence and companionship, and a sense of, as my colleague that I quoted in the talk, Sandra Waltorton, and her Aboriginal colleagues, as they say, this is a process of becoming family with country. And I have really, really felt that with this granite outcrop. And ontopoetics becomes not so much moments of revelation, however lovely they are, but more of an integrated aspect of one's life that starts to plot the direction of one's life. And starts to guide what one does, like what one's aims in life are.
That's amazing. Yes, I was thinking about instances of ontopoetics, but it's when it becomes embedded and a way of living on country.
I think it does. I mean, clearly it is like what I'm calling ontopoetics, just to put a Western gloss on it, and not to presume that I understand what Aboriginal people are experiencing. But what I'm calling ontopoetics here seems to be akin to very integral, if not the deepest aspect of Aboriginal life. It's what plots the direction of a society and what people decide to do each day when they wake up in the morning. It's like, well, where should I go to do this? And there will be like a sign, a response, a bird will fly past, and that will be your clue to where you should go that day. Again, I'm speculating here because I'm talking about Aboriginal experience, and my experience is nothing like that. My experience, if it's authentic at all, is at kindergarten level relative to that. But that's what I seem to see as how ontopoetics becomes internalized as an integral kind of compass for life.
It's like the opposite of a whim. I can wake up in the morning and think, well, I feel like, but that is such a, for me, it's like an element of all of those distracting things. I've got so much to do
Yeah,
and
yeah,
so many calls and demands and so many things that I think might be the good life and to go out and enjoy. But to do that in the context of the country, of the land that I'm on, to be a whole lot slower, a whole lot more listening.
yeah.
I have some tiny intimations that changes the way what you decide to do in the morning, as you say.
And I think it's to do with the fact that when you're living on country like that, or even that's, even if you're just taking some first steps towards that by living, on like a reserve that you're really absorbed in trying to ecologically restore, bring back to health, but you're absorbed in it, you're entwined with it. That's all a relational fabric then.
Mm,
So it's like there is a movement through the fabric. There are movements all the time that you will become aware of that are kind of opening a way for you at each point. Whereas what you described as what faces you when you wake up in the morning is just a whole medley of discrete, disconnected things. There's no flow.
mm, yeah,
And so there's no intrinsic direction for
yeah.
you amongst that.
Mm, mm,
Get back out on country, not just as a a hiker or somebody who's having a picnic or enjoying the scenery or something, but somebody who is actually getting in there and trying to help this country to recover
yeah,
so that you're in some kind of the process of communion with all
yeah,
the life around you. You will start to feel that flow. So, I mean, that's just like, I see that as one possible step towards a more holistic experience of life that
yeah,
non-Indigenous people might take.
yeah,
And it's just that you're inviting an ontopoetic response, but you're also doing your best from your kindergarten starting point to serve deep law. You're trying to provide opportunities for the ecosystem around you. You're trying to satisfy its needs. And in the process, it's giving you back
yeah,
things that perhaps you didn't even know that you
yeah,
needed, like
yeah.
not food so much as
So how might, given that there's billions of us and you touched on this and we're all living in cities, the vast majority of us, how do we how do we get these pods of nascent culture, which I think is the most fantastic expression. How do we get those going where we are on the country where we are in our, I'm in the middle of London.
well, you're in the middle of London, but and there are, I mean, first of all, there are environments in need of restoration that you could choose to become a custodian
Mm,
in this non-Indigenous sense, this kind of conservation sense of a patch of land and make it your responsibility, like integrate that into your life in the way that you integrate your responsibility for your human family into
mm,
your life.
mm,
You can always do that. You don't have to own land and you don't have to go outside of the city. You can find places in the city that you could dedicate yourself to in that way, an ongoing way, a lifelong way,
mm,
a practice, a
mm,
personal practice that you could adopt. And of course, you could also find a place outside of London there's no shortage of places in need of ecological restoration outside of London, that you could engage in this kind of, I call it walking the land, this practice of being on country in an ongoing way in order to restore country. Just by analogy with Aboriginal ways of walking the land. Different, but analogous, because there's that kind of deep involvement of walking over the land anymore. You're actually going into it. So I think that practice of walking the land is available to a lot of people. Not necessarily, I mean, some people wouldn't have the time to do that and so on. So that's one personal practice. And then there are things like the cooperative inquiry groups in the living articles. I mean, anybody can start one of those. That's a practice that one can adopt. In my own history, like pilgrimage has been really important as a undertaking to walk my local creek, the Merry Creek, that I acknowledged at the beginning of our session.
And I recommend your book about that to anybody listening.
After years and years of walking the creek in its urban stretches, I decided it would be wonderful to discover the source of the creek, to walk the entire length and see what lay, beyond the city, because the Merry Creek rises in the Great Dividing Range, the hills to the north of Melbourne, and wends its way down through farmland till it comes into the northern suburbs of Melbourne, Naarm, and then it empties into the Yarra River, the Birrarung River. I did organise with some friends at one point years ago to walk from the Yarra, the confluence between the Merry and the Yarra or Birrarung, and just follow the creek up to where it rose, see what we found. And that took 7 days, and we went as pilgrims, just asking for hospitality from the people we met along the way, and like sleeping in stables and things like familiar tropes like that. Stables or sheds in the back, or whatever people had available to offer. And that too turned out to be the most incredible journey into poetic revelation on the part of the creek. I mean, what it offered us, poetic revelation is probably the best expression. So that's another practice. And then I think, it's up to people to discover.
Pods, plurality. I mean, you touched on plurality at the start. I mean, every place, every group, every person has got to
every person with their own frame of reference, their own personal cultural frame of reference. Another thing that I did that was incredibly ontopoetically rewarding was going on a journey to outback Western Australia and just staying there largely on my own. I stayed at in a shearer's shed on the back of the station, but went out each day to these granite outcrops and just spent a lot of time out there on my own. And that was incredible. I will never divulge the things that happened there. It's far too private, But it was, again, just so richly rewarded, the effort to do that, and kind of the intention and the invocation that lay behind that kind of pilgrimage was so kind of acknowledged and rewarded. So those are personal things, but maybe, I mean, were you thinking of like on a societal level, like
Well,
how we might?
ultimately, I'm aware we time is a thing here, which we wouldn't be if we were out onto poetically on country, but yeah, I mean, absolutely. Eventually, we are facing crisis in a way that humanity has never faced crisis before. So absolutely, this is where we have to be, isn't it? Start at the deepest kind of level of connection, and yet imminently we face all kinds of catastrophe. I wonder, do you think, what's the future? I've heard you say before that that big vision is, I'm paraphrasing, big vision is difficult, and it's the kind of step by step approach that we need to do. Um, how do we do that in an
Well, I
imminent
mean,
crisis?
that's big vision and big vision. I mean, I'm not a big fan of kind of
Yeah,
blueprints for a new society,
yeah,
blueprints for change. But I am quite a fan of big actions.
yeah,
Like they might be first steps
yeah,
towards change, yet still big.
yeah.
Um, and
And
maybe
they might be global. I mean, the
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
they might be global. They might
the,
be
the,
global. I'm thinking of it might be a bit too much to embark on at this point, but you said at the beginning you hoped that I would mention the Tao of civilization. What we might do at the level of economic praxis to be to begin to try to conform to that logic of accommodation and least resistance, to conform to deep law at a societal level. I can see some first steps towards that.
yeah,
And they're not, and these are steps that do actually have some currency now in global climate change discourse and a few other discourses. They're going by the name of nature-based solutions,
yeah,
and they're very instrumentalist. They're not at all philosophical,
mm,
but they can be adapted to the kind of deep law perspective, the holistic perspective.
hmm,
And it's exciting that people, even if they're thinking about these possibilities in a very instrumentalist way, it's exciting that they're thinking of them
yeah,
because, as I say, there to me lies a path.
yeah,
And at this stage, it's really only opening up possibilities for climate change mitigation and to some extent for food production. You can see in the just in a shadowy way in the distance possibilities for architecture as
hmm,
well.
hmm.
So rather than getting all tangled up in that now, maybe I'll just refer people to the Tao of civilization and to to the end of the book where some of these possibilities are explored. Because
Amazing. Yeah,
I agree, it must be at the level of praxis, not
yes,
only because that's how I mean, economic praxis, not only because that's how we are impacting our world,
yeah,
obviously, but because I don't think that we will, as societies, we will ever develop any authentic ecological consciousness unless we're embedded in everyday economic praxis,
yeah,
forms of production, forms of livelihood
mm,
that are actually ecological.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I don't think we can decouple our industrial society from, like the project of environmental conservation.
No,
Um,
no,
they
we are where
need
we
to,
are. Yeah,
well, they need to be meshed because
yeah,
if people are living in a fully industrialized form of economy, they won't have the will to pursue ecological conservation to anything like the degree necessary for the planet to recover.
mm,
You know, there'll just be these pathetic little pockets of biodiversity, that
Yeah.
is just like a travesty
Yeah.
of what we need. All strength to the people fighting for those.
Mm.
As a global society, that is a travesty
Yeah.
of what the planet needs.
Yeah.
So we need to try to revision our economic practice
Mm.
in that way,
Yeah.
and to deindustrialize it. And I think we can see the beginnings of that, but not further at this point.
Okay. Something for another whole series of conversations. Freya, thank you so much. That is unbelievably rich, and so many more things we could pursue. But for now, really, thank you for your time and your life's work that you've shared with us today.
Well, thank you, Deborah, and thank you for the beautiful work that you and the team at St. James are doing. And I look forward to tracking your progress there and seeing how things develop. It's very
Fantastic.
inspiring.